Thanks, Sarah. Let me see if I can start by addressing maybe some different audiences. We've got international audience, national audience, state and local audience, and I want to see if I can speak to each one of them with a brief update and where we stand. From the international perspective, we've had heads of state from a lot of different countries. In particular, I would stress today and yesterday, the heads of state, Mexico and Canada, called to express their condolences, their prayers and thoughts, but also assistance if they could lend anything to the effort. We very much appreciate that, and the president was deeply touched by those phone calls. I joined him for the call from Justin Trudeau just moments ago, and we appreciate the neighborly gesture quite seriously, and it's an international expression of what we're seeing here at a very local level. We've got neighbors helping neighbors in Texas and Louisiana, but also neighbors that aren't in close proximity internationally expressing help. So our international neighbors of Canada and Mexico are also offering their condolences, and we very much appreciate it. We're seeing deployed assets now from a lot of states. I know we've got 28, for instance, search and rescue teams and task forces from, I think, 16 different states, all sending down their support to Texas. That's a pretty large activation. In fact, I believe that that's the first time we've activated all the task forces since 9/11. So this is a all hands on deck operation, and it's not just a federal one. There are state and local officials from all walks, even from Pennsylvania, where I'm from. There are people now addressing this problem by getting their hands dirty and going right down to Texas to help. So we want to stop and say thank you to them for that. And then, if I can move to the nation, many of you are watching this and you want to hear from us what we're doing. I want to make sure you understand that you should continue to have confidence in what we're doing as a government. There are significant commodity numbers and numbers of personnel and material moving into this affected region, and it's an increasing number every day as we move forward. But I would be remiss if I didn't stop and say that none of that matters if you're an affected individual. So 10,000 liters of water doesn't matter if I don't have the 1 liter I need to drink right now. And so if I could, I'd like to stop and give a message or two directly to the people who need the assistance. And if I can, this might sound a little bit mundane from a White House podium, but if you're in need of assistance and you have access to a functioning computer, if you can get to a shelter or someplace where you can do this, it's very important that you go to www.disasterassistance.gov. You can find what you need there to register for the assistance that you might need. If you don't have access, but you can find a working telephone, 1-800-462-7585. Again, 1-800-462-7585. There's another number that FEMA's given us of 621-3362. I'm going to clarify and say I think 621. 1-800-621-3362. That's the number. 3362 spells FEMA. That second number of 7585 is the TTY number. I want to make sure that people use those numbers and use those resources to register. I'd also like to give them the advice that it's never too early to call your insurance adjuster. Make sure if you have property loss or damage, you've got that process underway. It can take some time. There's going to be a high volume of calls, and we want to make sure that your needs are attended to as soon as possible. So that's where we stand right now. I'd like to go through a few additional messages. Life-saving and life-sustaining operations are still underway. We've seen some hospitals suffer some damage in Beaumont. Most of you that are tracking the event have seen that. The DOD and the HHS officials responsible for coordinating the federal response here are actively figuring out and deploying resources to help move those patients to better definitive care locations. So we will see probably upwards of 7,000 estimated patients moved into better and safer definitive care hospitals elsewhere in Texas, and we'll see that happen expeditiously, and I'm quite comfortable with where those operations stand. Secondly, a little word of caution, a lot of lost lives end up in this time zone right after a response. We lose, unfortunately, some lives in an immediate disaster, but then in the immediate response and recovery phase, people will use chainsaws, people will remove debris, people will be stressed. The elderly, when they're stressed, you heard Dr. Fauci say, tend to get sick. That sickness can lead to death, unfortunately. And so, unfortunately, we will see additional losses of life if history is any precedent here, or if that history is any prologue. We will see a additional loss of life. So please try to avoid that. Try to avoid strain and stress. Try to get to where there's food, water, and shelter, and take care of yourself so that you can then take care of others. With that, I'd like to suggest that from the FEMA perspective, they're continuing that operation, but from the White House, it's important that we look at the cost of these events and that we look on the horizon a little bit about what's next. So as we look into it, These are estimates at this point, but it looks like round about 100,000 affected homes. That's a big number. We're going to have 100,000 affected homes, all with different degrees of insurance, some with flood insurance, some underinsured, some uninsured. We'll have to address those on a case-by-case basis as we move forward, but I want to put a scope and magnitude on this. We're also going to have damage to publicly owned infrastructure. And so what we will do as an administration is put together a responsible supplemental request for Congress, appropriations request. We'll make that request shortly. We'll make that request based on the information that we have now, and what we'll do then is come back later for a second supplemental request when we have additional information that would make a more informed total for Congress to consider. So I'd like to stop on that point and take a few questions.
Sure. Question for you. Obviously, after Hurricane Sandy, some money flowed fairly quickly, but the big bill didn't happen until 2 months after the hurricane hit. Hurricane hit on October 29th. The bill was signed into law on the 6th of January. How important is it, do you believe, with Texas for Congress to get that money through faster? The president promised it would happen quickly.
Yep. So 3 things here. First, you have to look at the health of the Disaster Relief Fund, which is funding most of this operation. That was a relatively healthy fund. It had about $3.6 billion in it heading into this storm. That allowed us to get through the initial response operations. That drawdown rate, though, is something that we keep a close eye on. We're going to need to go up and ask for a disaster supplemental shortly. We are also, secondly, heading up into the end of a fiscal year. And so any available money from a regularly appropriated perspective at a department or agency is running out. The end of the fiscal year is upon us. And so Congress had already planned to provide us some replenishment into that fund through the regular course of operations. And then thirdly, if there are and there will be needs for additional funding in the future, as those drawdown construction numbers become more clear on the recovery phase, we'll be able to look at them and ask for a third kind of bite at the apple on this. So that's where we stand, and I'm not worried at all that we don't have the money right now for the operations underway and the operations that we foresee in the next month.
Tom.
Sir, can I go first?
Thank you. You mentioned the offers of assistance from the leaders of Canada and Mexico. Will the president be accepting any of those offers of assistance?
Sure. The answer here is that the president didn't get into the specifics, and neither did the heads of state calling. So I think their primary purpose was to express and extend their prayers and their thoughts and their condolences to those that lost their lives. What we'll do is turn over to FEMA, the Department of State, to accept that request for additional actual concrete, or tangible assistance. FEMA then, as an Office of International Affairs, they'll figure out how to integrate that with the operators. If we have unmet needs that they can offer some valuable supply for, we'll take that. But there's no reason to not take that assistance.
Can you get back to us and let us know exactly what you guys said yes?
I would say yes, but I would highly encourage you to ask FEMA how that's unfolding, because you have to look at that from a very specific perspective. I've done that before, and the operators have to integrate something very carefully into a logistics chain that is complex.
Hey, Tom, can I follow up with a funny question here? You talk about what's next, and the recovery is obviously going to be not just months, but years in the making. This is also an administration that has proposed some pretty significant cuts to FEMA. Are you, given what you have seen and what the president has seen on the ground in Texas, are you encouraging the president to rethink those budget cuts? You've been in emergency management a while. Do you think he should reconsider that?
No, there's a number of misnomers on that. So the core operating function at FEMA is going to be well funded under the president's proposal. The Disaster Relief Fund, which really provides the money for these events that you don't plan for but that you prepare for, those things will be all well funded through that Disaster Relief Fund.
No cuts to disaster relief.
But what you will see are responsible proposals in the president's budget for reduction in some Homeland Security grants. Those grants, I was around for their creation. Those grants were never meant to be permanent. And what we need to do is reduce state and local dependency on some of that federal money, but we need to do it in a responsible way. So it's a little wonky, but you'll see not just a request for a cut in money in the budget that the president put forward, but you'll see some additional details that allow the states to responsibly develop a glide path to get off of those grants and their dependence on them over a period of 4 or 5 years or so. And so I would say understanding that's important for the American people to know that the president wasn't irresponsibly cutting any money. In fact, he was doing something that would further empower state and locals. And then I'd come back to reiterate the fact that the Disaster Relief Fund is strong. It's got plenty of money in it now, and we're going to ask for some very responsible surplus supplementals.
Tom, could you talk to me about the issue of those who are displaced? Temporary housing is a big issue. What can you tell us about what's happening over at HUD, what's happening with this administration as it relates to this? It was a big issue during Katrina, and it was a major problem. Are you looking at issues of finding and designating vacant locations for some of these people to, some of these victims or survivors to go into?
So I met with the chiefs of staff of all of the cabinet today, and we talked about housing quite a bit. What's happening now is HUD, in cooperation with FEMA and state and local officials, are starting to get together the available housing stock, both available rental stock, manufactured housing, which often fits a need in this type of disaster, but also available housing stock for those who receive assistance under HUD programs, Section 8 in particular. So we're trying to put all those housing stock solutions and all those government programs together, think through what's available and how people might utilize that. Right now, FEMA's doing that in a planning section, but their operators are focused on saving lives. So if I could, one additional point there, this will be a housing challenge, but I don't want to concede any kind of housing lack of coordination. What we'll have to do is allow a lot of this to unfold. And so when I say 100,000, some portion of those homes were affected with 2 foot of water or less. Some were affected with 8 foot of water or more. And you'll have to look at a case-by-case basis, the people and their, whether they're underwater financially and underwater actually, and we'll have to work with the mortgage lenders and others as we address those problems.
During Katrina, there was a big issue of when the people received housing, temporary housing, rent prices went up dramatically. Is there any kind of safety net or safeguard that that will not happen, that the survivors will not be gouged when they go into these temporary housing situations?
Yeah, you just used an important word, and I'll make a really clear point right now. The gouging will not be tolerated. Jeff Sessions and the President of the United States will not tolerate gouging. Anybody that's going to go out and try to take advantage of a disaster victim ought to expect law enforcement to come down on them with a hammer. That's not acceptable on a regular day. It's certainly not acceptable when people are suffering. What we'll do is use the latitude that we have under the law to come back to your first administrative point and provide a fair market value rental rate that's a little bit higher than 100% to accommodate the natural demand and supply tension. So that's okay.
To follow up on April's question about gouging on housing, what about gas prices? Is the administration looking at that in terms of national pricing against gouging for profit?
Yeah, gouging is a problem if it exists and if it happens at all levels in every vertical market and every horizontal. But I think the idea here on fuel is a good question. We had at one point in the peak somewhere around 4% of our oil shut in the Gulf due to the rigs having to pull themselves in. That number is going to come back online. But again, to take things back to housing, to bring back all the business operations in the Houston petrochemical triangle, we need to make sure the employees down there have responsible and safe housing. So while there might be some effect to our fuel prices as a nation, right now we're hoping that it's not a large or sustainable fuel price at the pump problem. What we'll also do is look for the health of the pipelines. So remember, there's still rain falling. Texas is, I think, not experiencing any rain today, maybe some small storms, but not any major storm. Now Louisiana and the rest of the Tennessee Valley and the middle of the country are starting to see rainstorms. The Colonial and the Plantation pipelines, we'll keep an eye on that. We talked about that today at our meeting, and if we have any update on that, we'll give it to you the rest of the week. Ma'am, can I go here?
Yeah, on this Crosby chemical plant that's on fire, the local sheriff there says the plume that's coming out of that plant is not dangerous to the community. The FEMA director says by all means it's dangerous. Which is it?
So if you were there, it'd be dangerous, but the good news is that the people around that facility had been evacuated already because of the storm and because of the notice that we had on the pending explosion. Some really responsible reporting, private-public partnership took place on that facility, and what we saw was that the electric power that went to the pumps and to the maintenance systems shut out. We couldn't responsibly get that power back, so the temperature rose in a concealed tank, and then or a confined tank, and we ended up having an explosion. So they're testing the air quality as local responders, but they don't know of anyone yet that's in that area of plume that would be affected. So if they were there, it'd be dangerous, and they have to keep an eye on it, make sure that they take it seriously. But for right now, the people don't seem to be there. So a tree falling in the woods, if you will.
I have one more question for you, if I may. There are 575,000 undocumented immigrants in Houston, one of the largest populations in this country. Does this White House believe they should be eligible for long-term federal recovery assistance?
No, I think illegal immigrants, and that issu's come up a number of times. So if you've committed a crime, that's the priority for the Department of Homeland Security. I think you've heard John Kelly say that, and pretty clearly the head of Immigration and Customs Enforcement and the head of CBP. What I would say, though, is in terms of immediate life-saving, no individual human being should worry about their immigration status unless they've committed a crime on top of coming here illegally when it comes to getting food, water, and shelter. So the authorities won't be conducting any routine swipes or searches inside those shelters. Those are shelters for food, water, and providing kind of insulation against exposure. So that will happen, and we won't go start rounding people up when they show up there. We don't want to discourage that. Now, subsequently, our priority will be illegal immigrants that have committed crimes. They're going to be rounded up as they always are and taken out of this country if we find them. I think that's pretty clear. Sir, can I go here?
Thanks a lot, Tom. 15 oil refineries went offline as a result of the hurricane. Is it your understanding that they've gone back online? Is this a concern for you? Are there any thoughts of tapping into the SPR, because this represents 25% of U.S. oil refining capacity?
Yeah, so I don't have an answer for you on the SPRO right now. Certainly the president will make that decision if necessary. You don't want to tap into the Strategic Petroleum Reserve if you don't have the refinery capability to handle that. So I haven't checked today on the status of the refineries, but I know people have, and I can get that answer back to you. We worry about that, but for right now, I'm not aware of any major damage to the refineries, and so that's why I suggest that to the earlier question, we might have an effect to fuel prices, but it shouldn't be a huge one. Don't hold me to it. We'll come back tomorrow and give you a better answer. Can I go right here?
Two questions. First off, Superstorm Sandy, the federal recovery package was around $60 billion. Governor Abbott has suggested this might exceed $100 billion. Does Governor Abbott's estimate sound reasonable that this will exceed $100 billion? And the second question is, we've received a lot of sanguine reports about coordinations between federal, state, and local agencies. Can you give me a sense of one or two challenges, areas where that coordination may require some improvement?
Sure. Okay, so on the first question, there's nobody that's wrong on estimates right now. I don't have any information to challenge anyone's estimate, and I don't think that they have any reason to think their estimates are wrong. So we're in the estimate game right now, and as a result, what we'd like to do is not get into second-guessing anybody, in particular the governor, who's got the first-hand knowledge of what's happening. But what we'd like to do as a strategy is figure out the predictable burn rate for the response operations and put up a responsible supplemental request to Congress so that they can meet those needs quickly. So that's the bite at the apple approach that I suggested. We'll go up to Congress and give them a sound supplemental request number. We'll add to it I think we've got some internal numbers that we're thinking, but I don't want to get out in front of Director Mulvaney as he works with Congress. But again, there'll be some regular funding coming in here as a matter of plan, because we're headed up to the end of the fiscal year as it is. And then we'll have a supplemental request later when we have better understanding and when we get a better handle on the damage. We can come back with a responsible last, so to speak, supplemental request and get the Congress to give us an informed amount of money. So, sir.
The second part of the question, Tom.
Oh, sorry,
were there any areas where coordination has been wanting, where you've seen a need for improvement?
No, I think at this point the message is that coordination is happening better than any storm that we've seen before, and so stressing on anything that's not working well really is, especially from this podium, going to be ill-informed. I'm seeing nothing but positive. I'm seeing nothing but appropriate coordination. If there's a problem somewhere, Brock Long is going to get his handle around it and he's going to fix it. That's my perspective. So not to be political on that answer, but I don't have a negative word on coordination right now. Sir, can I go right here?
Let me ask you about the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. 500,000 barrels were pushed out today. The Energy Department says during Katrina that on a loan basis, it was nearly 10 million barrels. So we're talking so far just a fraction of what was put out during Katrina. What is the administration's thinking going forward as to how the SPR will be used, and is what we saw today just a start of what might happen going forward?
Yeah, as I said, I'll come back to you on where we stand after talking to Secretary Perry. I don't have the numbers right now on what we're going to do and why. Again, though, I'd caution comparisons between storms. Every disaster is different. Every emergency manager knows that. Where the storm hits, what it hits, and who it affects constitute massive changes in how we respond to those storms. So in terms of your structural question, though, I think if any need for that Strategic Petroleum Reserve manifests, I think we'd be very comfortable in tapping into that and providing that alleviated resource.
Back in that supplemental question, there's some talk about attaching a supplemental to a debt ceiling increase, some talk about rolling a supplemental debt ceiling increase into an overall continuing resolution. From an emergency management standpoint, how important is it to your thinking to get a clean supplemental?
Well, I think everyone wants a clean supplemental, and so as we tie hopefully we get a responsible budget, right? And that the Congress comes together and finds a way to take the president's request and meet it. That would be an ideal answer. You're presupposing that we're going to have a continuing resolution. That's not the best way to run a railroad, but based on your question, we might have a CR. If that happens, that's fine. I think it'll also happen, not fine, but less ideal, but nevertheless fine to my needs as a emergency manager here looking for a DRF supplemental. The DRF supplemental, when you say clean, should focus right now on replenishing the disaster relief fund and any other ancillary and obvious needs that might come for other departments and agencies for repairing roads or highways of that nature. But I think that'll be separate and distinct from the debt ceiling. I think we have every reason to believe that that's going to happen in a responsible way as well, and I'll allow Sarah to amplify that if you have any additional questions. But from my perspective now and from the planning session we had this morning, I don't think there's going to be any particular problem in our approach to the Congress in this fall. That's at least my sense.
Can I ask you about
I'm just a little bit confused about your answer to Cecilia. I just want to go back to that on the idea of undocumented immigrants getting long-term funding. Was that a yes or a no? Does the administration support that?
I'm sorry.
Was that she had asked
yes or no? What question?
On the undocumented immigrants eligible for long-term relief help?
What happens once they leave the country? Are undocumented immigrants able to get additional help from the government?
Well, so eligibility standards range across a number of different programs, and the point here would be that if you're an immigrant that has committed a crime, you're going to be removed. If you're an immigrant, I guess the question is, that's looking for assistance that's eligible for citizens. That's my understanding that you're not eligible in that case. But I think that doesn't mean we're going to let somebody starve or die of thirst or exposure. So I don't think there's too much of a problem there. I'm not sure where they were living before they got into the shelter. I'd be making some pretty gross suppositions at this point that I'm not prepared to answer. But I understand the hypothetical you're driving towards, just not looking to deal with it.
Director Rice has made it clear that he views coming to the U.S. legally as a crime, and that they've picked people up and deported them. And so you're saying that the priority is still to deport people who have committed a crime on top of that. So from the acting director Rice. And so if you are an undocumented immigrant and you did have a home and that home was destroyed in a flood, you are in a shelter, what happens?
There's a lot of ifs there, and I'll figure that out as I deal with them. But from my perspective, the priorities couldn't be any clearer. So I don't think that I even know how to begin to answer that question. But I will say that there's no real wavering here. It's pretty clear our position on immigration. So hopefully that answers your question. I don't think there's going to be a lot of benefits going out to illegal immigrants in terms of the American taxpayer. But I will say that he's also made the point that those that have come to the country and then committed crimes constitute the priority offense that we need to focus on. And I believe that he also said that's not a victimless crime. And so I think that the focus on gangs and other things have everybody pretty well busy right now. And the focus on saving lives and providing food, water, and shelter have everybody pretty well busy right now. And I think what you'll find is the good men and women of CBP and ICE are out there providing assistance not only to the men and women of Texas and Louisiana that are American citizens, but also in the interim to people of any immigration status that need food, water, and shelter. So if I could, I'd like to leave it at that, because that's the clear message I want to leave behind to somebody that might otherwise, based on your questioning, no disrespect intended, be discouraged from going in and finding something that would save their life. So that's the message for today.
I did want to ask about the flood insurance program.
Yep.
Before this year, it was it owed the Treasury $25 billion. Now this. The question is, should homeowners who are in flood zones have to pay even more than they already have been paying in premiums to fund the program? Or should this be a problem that taxpayers help solve? I mean, at this point, this disaster proves that even if you're not in a floodplain, you still run the risk of having your house flooded.
Yep. So a couple of questions here, and I'm going to give you a couple of answers. First, just for clarity, because there are people right now suffering that are looking for immediate answers. For clarity's sake, if you have a flood insurance policy and you've been paying your premiums, call and get your claim in. There is no problem. There is no shortfall. We have enough money to meet those claims, and you're going to get what you've got coming to you under your policy. So that's the first, I think, answer here for the National Flood Insurance Program. The second one, for people watching this, you have to understand that flood insurance program is coming up to be reauthorized. It's about to expire. It's going to have to be reauthorized, and I have every confidence that Congress will reauthorize that program. And the third part of your question is, how much money is left in that fund under the borrowing cap or borrowing authority? And the answer is enough. I think it's $8.6 billion to get through this round of claims and then some. It'll push us into the late fall, winter time frame when we have to get into discussing what the forecast projections are. And then the last part of your question is a future policy discussion. I think that this administration has been pretty clear that we'd like to see some responsible reforms to the National Flood Insurance Program. I don't think now's the time to debate those things, as we need to help people that have pending claims, but we'll debate that late fall here as we come up with good policy ideas to help move that back into a risk-based private sector, hopefully supported solution. But FEMA's been pretty clear about how to do that and to do it responsibly so as to not throw anybody off that's on that current program. So for anybody that doesn't know, you can't buy a flood insurance program in this country that's not underwritten by the United States of America. The agent that sold it to you might be a private agent, and that's a public-private partnership that's been working since the Reagan administration. But at the end of the day, that standard flood insurance policy that you have, SFIP that you have, is underwritten by the federal government. So can I go back in the back?
Cecile's question about undocumented. The president is reported to be poised to make a decision about the DACA program. Right now, the Dreamers who are in that program believe that they are documented, to work, have work permits, etc. There are those who are in the pipeline who've applied for extensions or are new applicants. In the time going forward, what is your advice to them about their risks of being deported in any of those three categories under the DACA program?
Yeah, so the question's on deferred action against childhood arrivals, and I think what you'll see is that my position today is that the administration is still reviewing the policy. On the second part of your question, what happens to people that are in an illegal status that require assistance, I'd refer you back to how I answered the first question. Anybody needing food, water, shelter is going to get it. Anybody that's here illegally that's subsequently committed a crime is going to get caught and thrown out. And anybody in between has to wait for a decision or at least a policy announcement from the administration on how we're going to handle deferred action moving forward.
Do you believe that that is likely to be revealed in the days that are coming up now in which you're trying to manage an emergency?
Well, I don't know the timing of that, but as soon as the president's ready to announce the result of our policy process, he'll do so.
Have you been consulted on the decision?
I have.
Just want to ask, will the threat of lawsuits from the state attorney general, will that affect the decision or influence the decision at all?
Say that one more time.
The threat of a lawsuit from the state attorney general sends a letter to the DOJ. Will that affect the decision at all?
It won't affect the policy decision, but it will affect the timing of it. We certainly have to watch the lawsuits and how they matriculate through the courts and when the deadlines would be imposed. That'll inform our decision-making process, but it won't affect the policy decision. If I could now, I think I see Sarah standing up. I've been told to turn to, I think we have Skype questioners. Not that you folks in Washington, D.C. don't matter to me, but for the rest of the people watching, I'd like to turn to, where do I turn? We've got Skype questioners. Where do I go? Okay, so I think first, is it somebody from Texas that's going to ask a question from Skype, and how do I get that, Sarah? Here we go. Sir, you're on. Go ahead.
Okay, Greg Grugan, Fox 26 in Houston. Okay.
Greg, I got you loud and clear.
We have in the Houston area, Army Corps of Engineer reservoirs that are frankly failing to protect our citizens from flooding. Are you examining that situation? Is the administration considering adding additional resources to the crew?
I think, did everybody hear that question? I think, just to repeat it in case we're not wired up right here, I think the question, good one, was that people in Houston are worried about the two systems, the two reservoir systems that the Army Corps of Engineers maintains. They've been pictured on television overtopping. They've been in a controlled release environment, allowing a lot of water through the affected populated areas of Houston, and you want to know if they're safe and if there's any additional funding needed. Was that the question? Okay, I'm going to answer that question. I think that's a yes. The answer is, and it's just so happens that earlier this morning, almost just before I came out here, I was in contact with General Seamanite, in charge commander of the Army Corps of Engineers. And three answers here. First, he's got engineers monitoring those systems right now for structural integrity. So what you don't want to have happen is water come over the top and then eat away at the other side of the wall and have the structural integrity undermined in that fashion we've seen in previous events. As of an hour ago, there was no structural integrity determined by any of the engineers that are standing there watching the facility. And so that means that nobody's in immediate damage or I'm sorry, in immediate harm's way of damage and additional property loss. But then lastly, the question is, do we need any additional money to shore those facilities up? So I would turn and answer that a little bit differently. We're not going to get into a position of saying they're safe or not safe or asking for more money or not more money right now. what we'll do is continue to controlled release. The reason a controlled release is good is it's the alternative to an uncontrolled release. And so it seems like you're dumping more water on people that don't need more water. But if you don't do that, you'll end up with this structural integrity failure that I just referenced a moment ago. And so as soon as the water goes down, and it's rapidly going down right now, we're still going to have some flooding for some time. But the big, large, heavy masses of water that are going down and out right now are flowing in a way that will allow us to get in and do an engineering assessment over the coming days and weeks. And if there was structural integrity problems caused by the coming days and weeks or by the storm heretofore, we'll assess that. We'll put together a responsible number estimate for repair, and then we'll put it forth to Congress. And then very last on that, we'll do it in a way that thinks through a mitigation perspective. You just don't want to rebuild it to the way it was before and then have it undermined again. So when you put federal dollars into a project like that, you want to make sure you do it smartly so that the next storm doesn't cause any structural problems. So that's the way that process will go. It'll take a little time for the engineers, but the good news right now for the people in Houston is that both of those reservoir systems are holding up, and there's engineers sitting there watching them on a 24/7 basis. So thank you for that question, and thank you for doing what you're doing down there. I hope your home hasn't been affected. All right, do I have another question?
A lot of friends.
Is there one more? All right, sir, you're on.
Hi, this is Justin Sturmerg with KTRK ABC out of Houston. How are you?
I'm doing well.
What will you guys do differently? I mean, we've had disasters all over before. How do you reassure the people of Texas that real help is coming and it's coming quickly?
How do you reassure people that help is coming and help is coming quickly? Well, there's a real short answer to that. We send help and we send it quickly, and I don't mean that glibly. When we get requests from the governor, from the mayors, we send in as much as they ask for or more and make sure that they're there to meet those needs. The reassurance part comes in the kind of pudding, right? The proof's in the pudding. So if we're not getting to where we need to get, we need to hear that. And I'm not immune to criticism, and neither is Brock Long, and neither are the local officials there. The mayor has stood up and taken a great deal of smart criticism, but he's also taken a great deal of smart action. And from my perspective, what you have to do is hold us accountable. And what I think this president's doing, President Trump, is holding me and Brock Long and Elaine Duke and the rest of his cabinet accountable. And when we're not telling him what he wants to hear, he's getting right down to the governor and finding out if we're doing it right from his perspective. So that's the answer. I think it's pretty straightforward. Is there anything that's unmet from a need perspective right now that you want to inform us of? If you do have something, I'm 20 yards from the president. We'll take it to him.
I mean, not as of yet, but there's a lot of communities that have been devastated here, and there's going to be a lot of needs really quickly.
Yeah, let me pick up on that and use that because that's a great point to wrap up my remarks here today. We are still in response mode, and that means life-saving, life-sustaining. There are still people up to their waists in water. There are still the elderly and the infirm that require our immediate attention. There are still hospitals in need of evacuation and relocation. We've activated all those forces from DOD and from HHS to move those patients, but we're soon going to move into a long, frustrating recovery process. And the important message for me to leave to the American people and to the people of Texas and Louisiana at that point is that we're not going anywhere. And all this talk about supplemental funding, it's about having the money in the reservoir of cash, sorry to use that pun, having that money in the fisc for us to use to help you as we rebuild and get you back into your homes, back into your jobs, and get your kids back into their schools. That's what makes America great. We're going to have Houston and Texas bigger, better, and stronger than it was before this storm. And the resilient nature of the American people is just awesome. I couldn't be any more proud to be in this job, and I thank you for your time and attention. That's going to be the last question. A local gets it, I'm sorry, and I appreciate your time. Thank you.